63% of Americans now see China's economic power as a critical threat. So I kind of knew what was going on with China. I knew they were terribly polluted. I knew, it was corrupt. I knew the Chinese government controlled everybody. I just knew all these things. I got over there and said, wait a minute, this isn't lining up with what I have been told and what I thought I knew. It's not so much that we don't know anything, it's that what we know isn't true.
All right, everybody, I want to welcome into the studio Terry Wittenmyer. He is an American author of a book called Fearing China, and I'm very honored to bring him into the studio. Terry, how are you today?
Doing great, thank you.
I want to tell everybody a little bit about how we met. You reached out to me on LinkedIn, and you mentioned me. You said, look, I wrote a book called Fearing China, and I want to send you a copy. You sent me a copy in the mail. I really enjoyed reading this because for me, it was amazing to see an American businessman like yourself that has a lot of experience and, really was able to, see China, see a lot of the stereotypes that are presented in the West, but then actually go there. And, you do a lot of business with China. And so I wanted to, invite you on the show, wanted to talk about your book, but also talk about your story. So why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about the business that you have?
Sure. I've got a promotional products company that I've had for about 20 years. So we sell, mugs and caps and notebooks and pens and all those things with the company logo. It's a good business here in the States. Had it 20 years. We're mainly an online seller. And in 2008, decided, hey, I'm going to go to China and see maybe I can start buying direct because we buy most of it from suppliers here in the U.S. Okay. The product is still originally from China, but our suppliers buy it from China and store it here in the States.
Gotcha.
So I thought I'll just run over to China and see what's going on over there. And so that was 2008 was my first trip. And I think like a lot of people, the first time I went over there, I had these expectations. I'm a fairly well read. I read the newspapers. I watch the news. I know what's going on. So I kind of knew what was going on with China. I knew they were terribly polluted. I knew, it was corrupt. I knew the Chinese government controlled everybody. I just knew all these things.
Right.
And I think part of kind of the experience you had, I got over there and said, wait a minute, this isn't lining up with what I have been told and what I thought I knew.
Right.
And it reminds me of what Ronald Reagan, and I think a few others said, is that it's not so much that we don't know anything, it's that what we know isn't true. And so that's kind of what happened to me as I got over there. And my first trip, I was a little bit shocked. And then the second trip, the third trip, the fourth trip, I started seeing things really weren't lining up from what I was being told.
Yeah.
And so I started, taking a lot of notes and started doing some research on some of the specific topics that I would hear on the news or that they'd be reporting on, or I'd read an article. And what I found is when I would really dig into the backstory, when I would get into the more details, I would find out that those headlines and the things that they were telling me just weren't accurate. They were not only not accurate, they were almost intentionally misleading. So that's kind of my progressive trips into China. I kept learning more and more, and I was doing business with people in China, finding out, these are honest people. They're hardworking.
Yeah.
Holy smoke, they're hardworking people.
They are. No,
they work harder than I do, man.
The easiest thing that I always say is, make sure you go to China, experience it for yourself.
Absolutely.
I lived there for 10 years. I probably had 20 people come visit me in those 10 years. And every single person came with a certain set of expectations, and then left with, feeling very different about China, after they had come and experienced it. And I'm really amazed at your book because you've done a tremendous amount of research, things that typically, only people that really live there for a long time kind of have this level of knowledge. I was very impressed by your book. How deep you go.
It took about 2.5 years, and I really was just digging in because there was so much I didn't know about it, and that gives you kind of a fresh start. You start diving into the reports and all the NGO reports about background and poverty and pollution and corruption index and all these different things. And so, it's as you pointed out, it's almost a research document. It's got a lot of charts and numbers and graphs and references to UN reports and WTO reports and things like that. And It's a real attempt to give a true quantifiable measurement, when we're trying to evaluate China and what they're doing in different areas. It's only fair to as best we can, look at the statistics and look at the true facts and compare them to other countries, and in fact compare them to us, which is becoming more scary.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do in this episode is you have about 15 chapters in here, and each one of the chapters kind of talks about a specific fear that, maybe Americans would have about China. I'm going to pick 4 of kind of the ones that really stand out to me, and we can discuss them here today. I want to start with chapter 1, fearing China's growing economy. And I think that is something that, we've heard a lot about in the West, especially America. I mean, this has been, America has been used to being, the number 1 dominant economy in the world. So tell us a little bit about that chapter and, your thoughts.
Sure. 63% of Americans now see China's economic power as a critical threat.
Yes, so, that's right.
So we've been taught to really believe that their economic growth is a threat to us. And even at the G7 last month, or the beginning of this month, one of the U.S. guys said all participants said nations must counter challenges arising from China's economic growth. So at the G7, they're saying, how can we stop China's economic growth? How can we counter their growth? I mean, when they say counter China's economic growth, what are they saying? I mean, they're saying, how can we slow it down?
Correct.
How can we reduce their growth? And as you mentioned, the U.S. has been the largest economy in the world for 150 years, since 1871. We're just used to being the dominant player.
For sure.
And after World War II, we kind of set up everything. I mean, we set up the UN, we set up the IMF, the World Bank. So we kind of run all these things. We're used to having the power.
Right.
The reality is, just after World War II, we were 60% of the world's GDP. That's been going down over the years. Europe gets back in the game after they rebuild from World War II. Asia, Japan, they get back in the game, in the 70s and 80s. And now China's getting back in the game. And now we're all the way down to 20% of the world's GDP. So we're still 5% of the population producing 20%.
Right.
But that power is diminishing, and it will diminish over time. And so the question is that a real threat to us? I think it's not. I mean, the first thing we have to recognize, China's growing GDP is truly about improving people's lives. I mean, They've brought 750 million people out of poverty.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And that's something that I want to touch on that, because you take China's contribution to poverty alleviation out of the equation over the last 30 years, it would be a negative number, right? I mean, China's been responsible for 80% of the world's, poverty alleviation, and without China, I mean, we would have been regressing in the world. But because of China, we're actually progressing in this, and China's really leading the way. And I got this quote from your chapter in here. It says, to fear China's growing economy is to hope for less than the best for China. And it is to believe that our standard of living is contingent on the U.S. being the biggest economy in the world. I thought that was a really good insight that you shared, because, this is, China's economic success is a result of people's lives in China getting better. And I think you wrote it really well in your book as well. China has 4 times the population of the United States. Of course they're going to have a bigger economy than the United States.
Yeah. And realistically, if they keep pace, which I think they will, I hope that one day, and fairly soon, their GDP per capita will be the same as ours, so that they truly can have the same standard of living that we do.
Yeah.
Reality is, when that happens, their economy will be 4 times bigger than ours. Not just a little bigger, not just, they're finally matched us. It'll be 4 times bigger.
Right.
So that has a lot of implications in size of military, your relationships with other countries. I mean, as soon as Germany and a lot of European countries are already trading more with China than they are with us. So it has a lot of implications, but I think we have to really be pleased and happy that that's happening, that these are people's lives. It's education for people. It's healthcare for people. It's electricity. If you go out into Western China, this is about a house that has never had electricity, now has electricity. Maybe it didn't have running water. Now they have running water.
Absolutely.
If we're not ready for that growth, then what's our plan? Are we really going to say to China, no, we don't want you to have the standard of living. We want your economy to be smaller than ours. So we're saying we want you to have a GDP per capita less than 1/4 of ours.
Right.
So what
Right.
are you saying to the children of China?
A good point.
think you should have the health care that we have. You don't think you should have the electricity, the running water. So I think it's exciting. It's just amazing what they've done in
Absolutely.
bringing people out of poverty.
The United States has a great economy. We will continue to be very dominant in the world. I don't think that having China rising really is a threat to us at all. I mean, in many ways, I think China is still looking at America as a leader. Even if China has a bigger economy, a GDP that rivals us, there's still going to be amazing companies that are going to be innovating. They need foreign investment and better partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's and you can see it on the ground when you go to Shenzhen. That's where you really see it. I mean, 25 years ago, that place was just fishing village,
That's
and
right.
now it is a standard of living that is amazing with the housing and the infrastructure and the mass transit. You see the difference in people's lives, and that's exciting to see. And I think we should be rooting for that and excited about that.
That's a healthy perspective. Well, let's go into the next chapter, which is chapter 5, and it's fearing China's intellectual property rights. I think this is important because you have a company that manufactures a lot of products in China. Tell us a little bit about this chapter.
On intellectual property rights, I think the most interesting thing is that China's economy is becoming more and more dependent on technology and intellectual property. They, of course, broke out with manufacturing, right? Well, now they're into basically R&D and the technology and bringing out all these new technologies. As China becomes more dependent on intellectual property, they have a vested interest in having good intellectual property law because they're shooting themselves in the foot if they're not protecting the patents of Huawei or protecting the patents of their own designs. So as they come into this, and they've been dramatically improving already their laws and their law enforcement on intellectual property. Huawei is going to collect over $1 billion in royalties on their G5 patents, and they're collecting that from companies like Apple and other companies.
That's right.
So China is in the game, and to be in that game, you got to keep working or keep going toward those international rules. I did also see the other day that in 2019, that was the first year that China filed more international patents than the U.S. did.
Yeah, I think it's amazing because, as we know, we always used to think of China as a place to make cheap things. I've seen a huge shift, of factories moving out of China because wage salaries have been increasing, the standard of living, insurance. It's not these cheap factories that you can make a bunch of T-shirts in China anymore. I mean, it's very expensive now, and so as a result, they've shifted into artificial intelligence, robotics, high-end technology. And that is really what is driving the future of China. So like you said, in order to do that, you have to be investing in intellectual property rights, patents. I like this quote in your book. It says, "It's not the US lecturing and complaining about China's lack of IP law that is driving China to improve their law. It's the reality that solid intellectual property laws and law enforcement is the only way for China to continue their economic advancement." You see the digital currency that's been launched, the amazing, I mean, China's basically a cashless society now. I mean, they are innovating for the future. And Shenzhen, that city you mentioned, that is the city of the future, right on display in China.
It is. And one thing that I try to stay very aware of now that I'm kind of in tune with it on the IP law and thinking about how the Western media, in particular the US media, reports on it. Apple is in lawsuits all the time over intellectual property. Apple sues other companies. Apple gets sued. Apple owes this company $1.1 billion in patent infringement fine.
Wow.
When it happens to Apple, the media calls it patent infringement.
Right.
When it happens to a Chinese company, they call it intellectual property theft.
Correct.
So it's important for us to really pay attention to the semantics and the verbiage that's being used because it really is a double standard.
Yeah.
If it's Huawei or if it's Apple, look, if you creep over into somebody's patent and the courts say, hey, you owe them money, let's call it one or the other. Either say Apple is convicted of intellectual property theft,
right,
or let's say Huawei, is got on the wrong side of intellectual property infringement or whatever. But let's be consistent. But we see that all the time in the reporting, that the verbiage and the semantics really just skews it to make China look bad. It's theft if it's China. And I point that out in a lot of the different chapters in the book. Just the verbiage of the headlines is just treated differently because there's a innate bias that we've built up in our society over the years. So even the media gets trapped into this, that they just use different verbiage because they assume China's the enemy. They assume China is on the wrong side of it. So their verbiage is just innately different for other countries. So it's something to really pay attention to.
Terry, let's go to a big chapter here, is chapter 12, which I like, which is Fearing China's Non-Democratic Rule. And a couple of things. I'll start this off by a couple of the quotes that you said in here. It says, in the West, we typically only really know two forms of government. We know democracy, of course, and we know dictatorship. That's kind of what we only think about. And, growing up in school, I like this quote. What you said is, we're always taught that democracy, not only is it the best form of government, it is the only form of government that should exist. And this has really been ingrained in the mindsets of Americans. So tell us a little bit about this chapter, because I thought you did a really good job of breaking this down.
Sure. In this chapter, the first thing I like to start with is the purpose of government. And our U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence kind of tell us what we think the purpose of government is. And like the Constitution says, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Declaration of Independence calls it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think we have to start with that first premise of what's the purpose of government. And then when we get into how we select our leaders, whether it's democracy or some other form, unfortunately, sometimes we elevate that method above the purpose of government. China has a different form of government. They're not a direct democracy. They're a type of democracy, which is they define it a little different, but they aren't a Western-style democracy with direct elections for their president.
Correct.
But they're also not a dictatorship. There's a lot of dictatorships around the world. China is more of a meritocracy in their government. They're run more like a company. Correct. So you work your way up the top. Xi Jinping was the head of two very large provinces before he went up to be the leader of China, to be the president. And so they treat it more like our corporate structures do. You start out in the mail room, and then you're on the floor, and you're an assistant, and you work your way up. Well, that's how China does it, and it really helps them to pick some really talented leaders.
Absolutely.
And democracy has its problems too, right? I mean, democracy, we see it right now in the U.S. We see some real challenges. But around the world, we see that there's not always a correlation between democracy and successful government, or democracy and those things that we pursue, the purpose of government, the general welfare, the tranquility. Like Thailand's had a democracy since 1932. They've had 17 constitutions, 20 prime ministers in the last 24 years. So pretty unstable. You got the Philippines, they've been a democracy for 60 years, and they're still at a GDP per capita under $3,000. So there's not a direct correlation.
Absolutely.
And what we saw in China is that their system, their meritocracy system is working very well for delivering what we hope government is structured to deliver.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, and I like in this chapter as well that you talked about Singapore, which is really arguably probably one of the most successful stories of any country in the world, the past 60 years, how they started. And, Lee Kuan Yew, amazing leader, amazing visionary, for what he set out for the country of Singapore, very much the same in the sense that it is a type of democracy, but in the sense that it's a very limited, very controlled,
Mhm.
and it has been a one-party state, since Lee Kuan Yew has,
Right.
first came in as the prime minister. But you can see the economic results speak for themselves, and I think that's really an important thing when we get down to politics. What is the purpose of government? It really is to improve the lives of people and
Mhm.
citizens, and making sure that your society functions very well.
Right.
And I think if you look at Singapore, great example of that. If you look at China, how Chinese people are optimistic about the future of their country,
Right.
how they like the direction. One of the polls, 87% of people said, I feel optimistic about the direction our country is going. And the US, on the flip side, we're hovering between 35 to
Right.
40%, well below half. It
Mhm.
would say that, yes, the United States is moving in the right direction. And I think that really is a huge testimony to the success of a government. And that's something that I would like to see in the US government a little bit, is we need a little bit more accountability, in our politicians, and a little bit more proven track record, I think would be great.
Yeah, and that's hard to do in a democracy like ours. And I certainly am not advocating that we throw our democracy away and go to a Chinese structure.
Completely agree. Completely
But
agree.
but I think it's incredibly dangerous for us to go around the world, and especially going to China and saying, "Hey, we need to change them to a Western style democracy." Are you
Absolutely.
are you sure that if we did that, let's say we had that magic wand and we can change China to a Western style democracy, and next year they're going to elect their president. Are you sure they're going to get better results than they've gotten over the last 30 years? You can
Right.
almost be guaranteed they won't. I mean, look at India. India is a democracy. They still have 200 million people living in poverty, and
That's
they've
right.
been a democracy for quite a long time. So if you really look at the results, uh, I think it'd be very dangerous for us to go over there, or to continue our position of, oh, you need to be a Western style democracy. The people China want their democracy. They want their freedoms. Like, the people I talk to say, wow, my standard of living is so much higher than my parents ever was. The people I talk to in China are like, whoa, we're watching what's going on in the US with your democracy. We're not real enthusiastic about switching over to that.
I'll be clear as well. I'm certainly not advocating that the United States should switch. I'm happy that we have a democracy. I think we need to focus on the issues we have, and really work on that. And I think that's something that China's very good at, is really dealing stuff internally. If there's an issue, they're focused very much on what's happening in China. Seems in the United States, we focus a little bit too much energy on what's happening outside of the US. I say I'd rather see my politicians be a little bit more selfish. Just focus on US,
Yeah.
what are we doing in our country? What are we doing with our democracy, our government? Because we got a lot of problems, and we got a lot of Americans that need, a better government, one that really works for people.
Since democracy, at least our Western style democracy, is a real adversarial structure.
Yeah.
You have multiple parties just fighting each other. I've heard Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader of the Republicans, the other day. He said 100% of our focus is on stopping this new administration. I thought, holy smoke. Let's look at the issues you got on your table here. You got education, you got healthcare, you got poverty, you got environment. And you just said 100% of your focus is on stopping the other party.
Yeah,
What person is left over to work on the real issues that affect people's lives and the standard of living and improving our system? So yeah, we have a real challenge sometimes that we're not constantly improving our democratic process.
I agree.
And China has been pretty amazing in their flexibility. We think they're very fixed, but they're not. Their political system has changed dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. They try to identify, hey, where's our system, our political system not functioning like it should? How can we, again, deliver those results? What are the bottlenecks in our political system that are preventing us from improving healthcare, from improving education? And so they've made a lot of changes over the years, and they continue to focus on improving their political system, where we kind of get stuck in, we have our democracy and we just have to plow through it as is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. That's a good point. Terry, I'm excited for this next one. This is chapter 13, and it kind of leads right into this, because a lot of people say, Cyrus, democracy is a human right. Every single person in the world should have democracy. I think this is an issue that we can talk about a little bit more, is chapter 13, fearing China's human rights condition. Walk us through this chapter a little bit and kind of how I started off with that, you know, how a lot of people say democracy is a human right. Everybody should have that in this world.
Sure. On this chapter, I started out with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was created in 1948. They wrote up a Declaration of Human Rights to try to outline what are human rights and what should the UN and what should countries be pursuing as far as human rights. And you can break that declaration into three parts, really. The first one is freedom from physical abuse, and that's like slavery, genocide, war. So that first part is the most egregious of human rights abuses. I mean, that's murder and war.
Right.
The second type of human rights that UN document talks about is the rights to goods and services. So we're talking food, healthcare, shelter, things like that. And then the third type of right is individual action, the right to so freedom of speech, freedom of the press, reproductive rights, those types of the right to democracy, to elect your leaders. So that's the third type. So if we walk through those three types of human rights, the first one being, the right to be free from physical abuse, war, genocide, those things. China's actually done quite well if you rank them against other countries. And in fairness, I mean, this chapter was tough to write.
Yeah.
Because I'm an American. I look at what we do around the world, and we go into these wars. In Afghanistan, we caused the death of over 60,000 people.
Right.
Iraq, we caused the death of over 200,000 people. And you can go back further in history. You can look at Vietnam, 2 million people. We caused the death of 2 million people. You can look at the Korean War, 2 million people. So in this first area of human rights, China's been very restrained. They don't go around the world starting wars and killing people. So, and they've, so on the first category, I think China has been exceptional. The second category, rights to goods and services, housing, shelter, education, amazing. I mean, 750 million people brought out of poverty. On this second type of human rights, I don't know anyone in any country in the world that has done better.
Right.
And it's the third one that we beat them up over, even though these other two, war, that's kind of a secondary, just because we killed 200,000 people, that's different.
Right.
So the third one is the one that we beat up China about, and that's the freedom of the press, freedom of the individuals, and the democratic elections. But if we look at that third one, Xi Jinping said he said that protecting stability or avoiding social disorder at all costs is in essence human rights.
Yeah.
So their focus really is on those top two. The third, the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, democratic elections, they won't let those things interfere with the others.
Correct.
So they are focused on ensuring tranquility, ensuring healthcare, ensuring these things. And so when we elevate democracy up above all those others, I think it's a real mistake, because it diminishes the ones that are even more important.
Yeah, I think a good way to explain that is just the order, right? And it is ranked 1, 2, 3, and you could say that sometimes America would take the third one, we put that at the top, and
right.
And I've had many people argue with me, Cyrus, until it's one man, one vote in China, the Chinese people will never be free. And I remember from an earlier chapter, you had talked about, the United States, our political system. And we know that, you and I are both American. We get to cast one vote in the presidential election. However, you and I are not billionaires that control media, empires and can swing elections. And you talked about the Koch brothers, who had invested nearly $890 million in the 2016 election.
Right.
I mean, they could single-handedly, spend almost $1 billion and really swing the entire fate of a United States election. I mean, there is a price that you can pay to essentially buy an election. And I think ultimately a lot of the problems between US and China boils down to cultural differences.
We treat China so differently than other countries. If you look at Saudi Arabia, they're not a democracy. They have Saudi Arabia, for all practical purposes, is a communist dictatorship.
Right.
It's a king who is a dictator, and oil is their major revenue, which is state-owned, which means the king owns the means of production. That's communism.
Yeah.
But we give them a pass. We don't talk about them at all, and then we beat up China all day long on this one issue of democracy. And again, from our previous discussion, democracy is no guarantee that you're going to improve the way things are working. Yeah. So you can't really. I think it wouldn't be fair also for us to talk about human rights without quickly talking about the Uyghur situation, because that's kind of in the media right now. That's the biggest critique. I think we don't know much about that. China, probably rightfully so, isn't telling us much about that because they don't want our complaints or our input. But the thing I think about is China had a major problem with domestic terrorism coming out of that area. And we didn't hear about that much. I heard about it more when I was in China. You heard about the terrorist activity, that they were going into cities and doing some major damage with terrorist activity. So that is what's motivating China to be aggressive in trying to get that Islamic radicalism redirected.
Correct.
Think about what the U.S. did when we had a problem with Islamic terrorism, with extremists. What did we do? Oh, we didn't do. No, we did a lot. We went to the Middle East. We caused the death of a lot of people. We destabilized the Middle East. So we know that terrorism is a big issue, and you have to take action.
Correct.
China knows it's a big issue, and they're taking action. But at this point, looking at what we've done, I think China's done a better job of dealing with terrorism than we have.
You brought up some good points, and I think that's one thing that in the Uyghur discussion, there's one element that often gets really lost is the terrorist attacks really started happening. That was kind of 2008, 2009 with some big events, and I remember being in China and experiencing hearing these stories and a terrorist attack with 200 people live, who's live. And, in America, we're kind of desensitized to that because of the amount of mass shootings that happen almost every day in America. And in China, you don't have these things happening. It is a very safe society. And when you have a terrorist activity where 200 people are, killed, that is a huge issue for China. And that is something that immediately needs to be, handled correctly. And I think this is a complex issue, and this is something that they've been able to, certainly they're trying their best to manage this situation. Every country has to, ensure the safety of its citizens. I think that is, again, a basic human right, being able to live safely in your city, in your country. America needs to improve on that. That is something that American citizens do not have a high level of safety. Generally speaking, as compared to China, on the streets.
And I'm sure at this point, a lot of people in China, when we're talking about human rights, I'm sure they look at us and they see our news with the problem we have of some, police officers out of control, killing black people very indiscriminately. We've got 2 million people incarcerated in our prisons. If you count parolees and people that are basically parole is being under surveillance, we've got like 8 million total if you count incarcerated and under. So we have a lot of people that are in a sense oppressed or treated in not good ways. So I'm sure China looks at us and isn't real open-eared to hear our criticism of how they human rights in China.
Terry, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, Real Talk China. Everybody, this is the book, Fearing China. I'm going to put a link down in the description below for anybody that's interested. You can click right on Amazon and purchase that book. Terry, again, you've done a great job writing this book. As children, we're always taught never to judge a book by its cover. Unfortunately, I think a lot of Americans, we judge China without ever really trying to understand it. And I really commend you for going out of your way to do that, to really understand China, and then also taking on a project like writing a book. I really enjoyed this, and I would highly recommend this book to anybody.
Well, great. I think there's some just huge opportunities with China if we stop treating them like an enemy and treat them well and as a friend. I just imagine the things we could accomplish together in technology, environment, education, healthcare. They're going to be a powerhouse in technology and all these things. And if we if we partner with them, I mean, we could probably cure cancer by 2035 if we reached out to China and said, hey, why don't we do a joint thing where we're both working together to cure cancer? You could probably cure cancer. But, you know, the other option is we just go another Cold War and spend a lot of money on military trying to counter them. But yeah. I think we have a real opportunity to work with them and making the world a better place for all of us. So thank you so much for having me, Cyrus. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Terry. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing everybody in another episode of Real Talk China. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.